morning, everyone. Morning my time, afternoon and evening, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to the final day of the Ashoka U Exchange. I hope everyone is feeling as inspired and hopeful after spending time with our colleagues around the world to dream about the future of higher education. And I have to say, we are in store for a wonderful final panel, final keynote panel to launch this final day of the conference. It's really been a pleasure having the opportunity to listen, connect, and learn alongside with everyone. I hope everyone's felt the same in all the sessions. And as we reflect on the last few wonderful days, I can't help but think about the early days of Ashoka U. I think Dr. Charlotte was just asking me, when did Ashoka U start? And I remember very fondly back in 2008, when I walked into the Ashoka offices, we actually had a conversation with the Ashoka CEO and founder, Bill Drayton, and said, we have this vision, we have a dream to work in partnership with colleges and universities to build a platform and a network for how we can help develop and support future social innovators and connect a whole network of change makers through the platform of higher education. That was back in 2008. And it's pretty incredible to see how this community has shown up year after year, both in person and also online, like we're doing now. It just really proves to me the many ways that we've exceeded our expectations for when we launched Ashoka U. We've changed curriculum, culture, and programming in campuses, not only at our Changemaker campuses, but truly around the world. Everyone on this call has been a part of that. We've collectively graduated over 1 million changemakers over the past decade. And just think about that ripple effect of all of those changemakers going out into the world. I get chill bumps just thinking about it. And then for me, there's no doubt that higher education has embraced and integrated social innovation and changemaking to such a degree that it's increasingly the norm. When we started, this was just a niche program at a few colleges and universities. And now college students who are coming into universities expect to find programs in social entrepreneurship, expect to find programs in civic engagement, expect to learn about the importance of diversity and inclusion in their work in the community. And I know this community has played a huge role in making that the norm. But that has not been easy. It is not a walk in the park to change university curriculum. It is really deep work in the community to actually work in partnership, to listen, to not just bring an idea and make it happen, but to actually take into account people's input and ideas to actually make that a reality. This whole group, every single one of us has taken risks, advocated, kept pushing, and truly never gave up. Many of these university initiatives are not just one semester programs, they're actually 5 to 10 year strategic initiatives to actually change the institution. And that takes a lot of grit and perseverance. And so our hope is that the exchange has always been a place where you can feel a little less alone. One thing I've always admired about the exchange, many college or higher education conferences are just for one discipline. So all the English professors get together, or all of the scientists get together. This is the one place I've seen in higher education where any discipline is welcome, where students are in conversation with university presidents, and where we have practitioners also as part of the conversation. And I hope everyone feels like they have an important seat at the table. And so, now we're looking forward, and as we look back on the last 13 years of the Ashoka U story, we've really, truly felt nothing but gratitude, and we see it as nothing but success. Success in the fact that there are thousands of educators who now understand why change making is a critical part of higher education, and because of those millions of students that have been impacted by the work. And success because of this community will continue to live on in new ways that we haven't even been able to dream up yet. And so before our transition to the final panel, I want to take a few more minutes to recognize the many people who have helped to bring the exchange to life. So first and foremost, a huge shout out to our co-host, George Mason University. George Mason University was one of the first 4 Changemaker campuses. They've been with us since 2008 and really the flag bearers for much of the work that we're doing today. And it's a pleasure to be working with you so closely for the exchange this year. And I also want to specifically recognize the very wonderful and truly incredible Michelle King and Araceli Lara on the Ashoka U team. bringing together hundreds of people, coordinating all of these panels. It's nearly impossible work. And these are the two staff members who really made it happen. And so they've been key members of the exchange team actually for the past 2 years. They've put in countless hours behind the scenes to make it come to life as such a well-run event. And I know many of you have gotten to know them as you've prepared for the exchange. And so please give a huge round of applause or thank you to Michelle and Araceli in the chat when you have a chance. And we'd also like to thank Diana Wells, the president of Ashoka. I hope many of you have had the opportunity to interact with Diana, who's been just such a huge source of wisdom and guidance through our work. She has a huge depth of experience in international development and as a president for Ashoka for many years through the Ashoka network. And she has given us ongoing guidance, mentorship over the past 13 years. And we are so, so grateful for Diana. And of course, we want to thank the 42 Changemaker campuses. They have really, truly set the standard for social innovation and change making in higher education. But even more than that, have really set up a collaborative environment to co-create together through a network effect to bring about what do the best, what are courses look like, what do programs look like, and how can we actually spread and share those best practices across a broader network. And so you're all here for the final keynote. We now have a good group of attendees, and it is my incredible honor to introduce the role of higher education during times of upheaval. These visionary speakers in the panel will reflect on their own leadership journey and share how they've guided their institutions to continuously show up in the lives of their students and local communities. So please join me in welcoming Angelou Azilo, Ashoka Fellow and CEO of the Greening Youth Foundation, Gregory Washington, who's the president of George Mason University, Dr. Pascal Charlot, president of the Kendall campus at the Miami-Dade College, along with our panel moderator, Dustin Liu, U.S. Youth Observer to the United Nations and a master's candidate at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Over to you, Dustin.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Erin. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're clicking in from. Thank you, Erin, for that wonderful framing for our session this morning. And thank you to our panelists and listeners for joining us. I've been telling my friends and family all week that this is truly my dream dinner party to have this conversation, and I can't wait to dive in. Throughout this conversation, throughout this panel, we want to invite you to engage with us in the chat, sharing your questions, your comments, and your reactions. Feel free to use the chat or any other functions in our Zoom space to help us get a sense of how you're reacting to our conversation. We'll do our best to incorporate some of those questions in our conversation today. Like any other dinner party I host, I would love to open the space by grounding each of you in an introduction. And by way of introduction, I would love to start with a short but really loaded question. And that is, what brought you to this work? You know, how have your personal journeys brought you to center your work around higher education? We'll start with Angelou, we'll move to President Washington, and we'll close out our introductions with President Charlot. Angelou, over to you.
Sure. Hello, everyone. And I just want to first say thank you for having me on this very special occasion, and it kind of, my heart is feeling a little funny because I know this is our last Ashoka U event, and it's always such an incredible time, and I've met so many people engaging in this conference. So I just want to say, thank the Ashoka team for all that they have done, and also thanks the Ashoka Exchange universities that have made this possible. And to your question, Dustin, I would say what has informed my work in working with higher education and moving this forward is understanding. So as a leader of an environmental nonprofit organization, and just understanding that there's so many systems that are broken, that we need to change, and understanding that young people are really the change makers, the futures that we all need. So in doing this work and understanding that this new environmentalism that we all need to embrace for climate reasons, for economic reasons, or for future reasons for these for the planet, we need these young people, and the young people from these the higher education, particularly at these schools where social innovation and change making is embraced, that's where the magic is. So, you know, we started partnering with schools that were focused on change making and social innovation, to understand that these young people have been given the skills to be the leaders that we know we need to really move the country forward. So that's kind of how we started, and we've been partnering with them ever since. And we've had nothing but, you know, successes, because it's all about a mindset change and a mindset shift. And that's exactly what we see with a lot of these different universities and schools. I wish so many more would embrace it, because we would all be the better for it.
Angela, thanks so much for framing our session with this idea of magic, which is certainly what happens on our Ashoka U campuses. President Washington, over to you. What brought you to this work, and how has your personal journey centered your work around higher education?
Well, for me, I came through this track through an engineering lens. I was an engineering student at a predominantly white institution in the South, and were in classes where literally I was the only student of color, and or maybe one or two of us at most. And I went into laboratories to receive instruction from TAs in the laboratories and literally could not understand them. And so a group of us went to the dean and said, this is a problem. We have to figure out how to resolve it. We can't understand our TAs. Our classrooms aren't diverse enough. And there are no faculty of color to speak of anywhere in the engineering college, the whole college. There was not a single one. And, you know, he talked with us for a while, and on the way out of the room, he tapped me on the shoulder and pulled me back in. And I said, oh Lord, I'm getting ready to get kicked out of school now. But this guy, he sat me down and he said, look, I've seen your grades. They're great. You have to make up in your mind whether you're going to be part of the problem or part of the solution. I've never forgotten those words. And he said, you need to go on, get your advanced degree, go to grad school, get a PhD, and then do what you can do to change the system. I did just that. And he made a promise to me at that spot. He said, if you continue, now he did, it wasn't all altruistic, because if you continue and if you stay here at NC State, I will guarantee you that you will not pay another dime to go to school.
Oh, wow.
As far as you want to go. And I took him up on that commitment, and I went all the way through and got my PhD. And that began my academic career. And so what that has highlighted to me is that the power of a single voice is real. Mm-hmm. We can actually engage, we can touch people directly, and we can usher those people in to have impact on their societies and on that nation. That one conversation, that one chance conversation, to be totally honest with you, has set me on a career pathway that puts me in the position that I'm in today.
President Washington, your story just reminds us of the importance of changemaker educators, the power that we have in higher education communities to really help students see their potential, see their magic. And I'll pass it over to President Charlo to wrap us up. What brought you to this work, President Charlo?
Good morning. I'd like to also echo the sentiment of gratitude. It's actually such a blessing to come together to talk about how do we change the world. This is not a conversation everyone's having, and to have it with the kind of thought leadership that's on the call, and also with the 13 years we've invested in building this conversation. This is a very powerful moment where we get to make a decision. And I love the fact that we have a very diverse panel engaged in this work. You know, I also appreciate following Professor Washington, because his story is why I'm in this space. You know, I fundamentally believe in the democratic ideals of this country. I'm a daughter of Haitian immigrants. I always joke I didn't land on Plymouth Rock, I landed in Brooklyn. And so many of us did land in some space with a very different narrative for what it means to access the American dream. And what I've found in my own personal experience is my life is different because I had access to an education. Fundamentally, the trajectory of all of my choices and the impact I can have and how I found my voice is because of the quality education I received. But what I've learned being in those spaces is there's not a big difference between the folks who have access to a quality of education and those we are leaving behind. And I think it's critical for those of us in leadership roles to be mindful of the kinds of environments we're creating to ensure that everyone can access their full potential. I'm so proud to work at Democracies College, which is primarily an institution that offers 2-year pathways. We are an open access space. That means no one gets left behind. And it's particularly critical at this time in the life of our country when we become a majority minority nation, that we be really clear about how we set up new systems that aren't necessarily replicating the old models, but that are honoring who we are today and the assets we have and the human resources we have to shape a very different kind of future. And so I appreciate the fact that we are at a critical moment in also shaping the future of our democracy. You know, a democracy is it's very adaptable in how it responds to the challenges of the moment that we're in. And the fact that we have been preparing for this time means we are ready to also drive the future conversation of higher education. So I'm looking forward to this conversation, but more importantly, I'm eager to continue this movement when we start to transition from a centralized model to a decentralized model.
President Chiarello, you've centered our conversation to really broaden the idea of higher education. And in higher education, we're not just talking about coursework. We're not just talking about students coming into our campus community. We're talking about transforming lives. And we're centering the conversation around the defense of our democracy. And I really appreciate how you framed that for us, because it shows us the beacon of hope that higher education can provide, specifically in this time of upheaval. Gonna pass it over to President Washington now. We've had a chance to ground ourselves in each other's experiences. Curious if you can start by framing the what. What is happening in higher education? What are the current gaps or shortcomings you're seeing in the field? Lay out for us, what are those gaps that we need to mend? And President Washington, I think you're on mute.
I was on mute. Okay, let me first start off by commending what we've done this far. I don't think people realize the massive change. You know, upheaval is the right word. Universities have turned on a dime to meet the pandemic of this, to meet the challenge of this pandemic, right? Many have moved to modernized classrooms. They converted to virtual instruction. We've developed testing centers that not only serve our university, but also in a number of cases serve the whole communities that surround those institutions. We've established vaccine centers. We have a vaccine clinic and center right here on our campus, and that clinic serves the community. And we've implemented solutions to help the country move forward, right? People don't realize, but a large number of the testing solutions and the vaccine solutions have come in collaboration between corporate entities and universities. A large percentage of the LabCorp testing protocol that's actually being used to test people all over the country derives from some George Mason University technology. And you can find that throughout. So there has been a great awakening that has happened on our campuses. That being said, there are gaps, and there are real gaps. And look, the scale of change necessary to deal with the post-pandemic reality, and that's what's coming next, is not been adopted quick enough by universities. We are slow-moving entities in general, and we're not ready to deal with the combination of a post-pandemic reality in society where unemployment is real, the equity issues that have become apparent through the pandemic, and the fiscal issues that are mounting on top of that. And so that's one. And then the second is that the pandemic has highlighted real equity issues in the country. Look, I fundamentally believe that an unequal society cannot respond appropriately to a pandemic. And we've actually seen the case of that here. Just a few days ago, the EOS Foundation, an American Association of University Women, found that while the highest paid, found that the highest paid professionals at our nation's colleges and universities, arguably those that are yielding the most power, are still overwhelmingly white men, right? And so that's post George Floyd, that's post, even though on this panel, you have 2 university presidents, we are not the norm. We are actually the exception. And, mathematics has no opinion. Mathematics is truth. And the truth is that the numbers are quite small. We have a real unemployment crisis growing in our country right now amongst our college grads. The unemployment rate is over 8%. That's the highest it has been since the Great Depression, right? Usually college students can find the jobs. They're struggling now. And we're seeing that when you break that down by race, the numbers for Caucasian students, white students, the unemployment rates are half of the unemployment rates for African American and Latinx students. And so we have challenges in primaries. And then finally, I want to kind of connect to what Dr. Charlo said in the last segment. There are also equity issues in academic institutions. We are fundamentally operating still close to what is called a caste system in higher ed, where you have preeminent institutions and then there's a pecking order that just drops down. And the reality is that the broad group of people who need education the most have limited access to the premier institutions at the top. That's the reality. And we have to break that caste system up. Look, the reality of the situation is the biggest gap we're facing is that the change that is necessary for us to be the beacons of hope that we need to be for the country, that change has still not been adopted yet.
President Washington, really appreciate how you're reminding us that we need to view these gaps across multiple dimensions, across student success, but also diversity in higher education leadership. And this reminder that we really need to consider the fact that the system is replicating inequities right now, right? The system is creating durable inequalities, and that's what is, motivating us to have this conversation on ways in which we can reimagine that system. And Angelo, I'm going to throw it over to you now. We've heard a little bit about the gaps in higher education. We know the gaps that we need to mend. We know the gaps we need to mind. I'd love for you to share with us a little bit about your work. What can be made possible if we close these gaps and help us ground ourselves in a why? Why is there an imperative for us to aim to close these equity gaps?
Yeah, thank you for that. And for the most part, I love what Dr. Charlo said, that we're shaping a different kind of future. This upheaval that we've just recently experienced in 2020, I think was necessary. We've had systems that have not been working for all people. So it needed this upheaval to kind of shake things up and say, we need to figure this out. We need to do it again. I mean, we can't have this one size fits all education and think that it's going to work for everyone. Too many people are being left in the gaps. And so we in fact, if we want large scale, we were talking about change. If we want large scale change and innovation, then we need large scale collaboration. So, I'm happy to say, and I'm happy that you all even thought of putting me on the panel with Dr. Charlo and Dr. Washington, because that's exactly how it has to happen, with collaboration. So we've been working in between the gaps for 15 years at Greening Youth Foundation. And, I'm a product of an HBCU, Spelman College. And, I have to give shout outs to HBCUs, tribal colleges, and so forth, because the approach is always working with a holistic approach to that young person, and no longer are we focused on whether they can afford to be there or this elitist approach that only certain people can be in college. We're at these different institutions and at these different social innovation and change-making institutions. It's all about considering that whole person, understanding the culture, the history, what they bring to the table to create this person. And I love hearing that, their 2-year pathways, just reimagining what's needed to have these young people succeed and to provide them the core competency skill sets that they need for them to be change makers so that they can take on a lot of these social and environmental issues that are plaguing society today. So Greening Youth Foundation has been working hand in hand. In fact, at the last Ashoka U exchange, partnered with Brigham Young University, who is a social innovation and change making institution, and worked with their social and innovation center, and have been working with them now for years. And they're doing a lot of research for us on various environmental issues. And their young people are trying to help work with us to come up with some of these solutions. So we're taking a very collaborative approach. But with these HBCUs, we partnered with a lot of our federal land management agencies. We have a flagship program called the HBCUI program that partners students from HBCUs, and we're going to be doing it with tribal colleges as well, and connects them to national park sites all across the country, because we need the innovation that these young people can bring to the table. So a lot of them who hadn't even had experiences at national park sites are now have their eyes open to the opportunities that exist there. So we're talking about an access issue as it relates to these young people. So we're really reimagining how we can engage them. And as I said before, the jobs are so critical. We can't there's too many people being left behind. When we have a graduation a rate, amongst African Americans of like 60%, what about, or 70%, what about the other 30%? We can't just leave them behind. So we have to think about trades and certifications and different types of programs that are responsive and speak to where they are and where they're trying to go. And in my hopes, it's all about clean energy, because we have to consider climate change and climate resiliency and mitigating climate. And it's a whole industry out there that our young people are not as engaged in as we need them to be. So there's so many opportunities out there, but we just need to imagine how we can connect all of these different players.
Angela, I'm really struck by the spirit of science fiction that you're introducing into this conversation, right? The spirit of reimagining what we think higher education can be. And inherently, as we're imagining and pursuing and working towards a future that does not yet exist, a future for higher education, a future for climate resiliency, that in and of itself is an act of science fiction. Right? This past year, we've been living in a science fiction novel, and what we're describing, creating a new world, really is, in and of itself, science fiction. And President Charlot, I'm going to invite you in to help us write a chapter of this science fiction novel. I would love for you to share a bit of a manifesto with us today. President Charlot, where do we need to take higher education? What do we need to do to update the narrative that we have of higher education in this very moment?
I think we've heard it. President Washington talked about the case system. It's real. Angelou talked about the need for partnerships, and that's essentially where we go from here. The inequities at the system level invites us to think about, what does inclusion look like when we're talking about the system? And if we're really talking about an inclusive system, what actually are we measuring? And I think right now, what we choose to measure in higher education has placed the four-year institutions at the center. And all the other institutions in the ecosystem actually work around the four-year institution at the center. So we often think of the two-year pathway as an on-ramp into a four-year degree. Or if we think about it purely as a workforce readiness credential, sometimes that's perceived as less than. When we think about the four-year degree, as previously mentioned, we think research institutions versus teaching institutions. And then from there, we decide what someone's future might look like. What could be different if we put the community college at the center rather than four-year institution? What then do we measure? How could we come up with metrics for grit, perseverance, working while going to school, the kind of project management that happens when you're in a multi-generational household, the fact that some of the students coming in these systems have multilingual thinking and speaking ability? How do we value courage and personal agency? Think about how that could change the game if we really honored the assets, and I love how Angelou described it, of the whole human being. We often talk about prior learning assessment in order to transition people who have worked into a two-year institutional pathway so that they can onboard faster and gain credit for the life skills that they've gained. What would it look like if that became an integral part of not only the two-year institution, but the four-year institution valued that same life experience that we see students coming into our institutions? If everyone became invested in the success of a two-year institution, how might we pay more attention to what's happening in the state legislatures, where funding is being cut to institutions that serve the largest number of students and are being challenged to find the resources to close those gaps? What do we think about the fact that some institutions that don't need another dollar are getting millions in endowment funds, and they're not thinking about how to partner with the two-year institution right down the road, and not thinking about how to partner with funders to come up with a model to ensure that that money can be redistributed where it's needed most? And so if we think about the core and the center of our system, where is it? Now, I want to challenge us to consider what are the implicit biases we bring to this conversation. Because what's interesting about this work, all of us are here because we have a personal experience in higher education. And very often at this level, in this kind of conversation, most of us have had a four-year experience. You don't see the same numbers of people who have had a two-year institutional experience in the design and creation of policy and in this kind of work. So where might there be implicit biases that we don't even know because we don't have the firsthand knowledge about what's happening in the community college context, which also requires us to really understand K through 12 differently. Because the other component of the two-year pathway is we are accepting the largest amount of students coming through K through 12 systems in all of our states and counties. And so that means we also have to understand where are the gaps, where are the challenges, and what can we expect coming from the K through 12 pipeline. We know people have been working in isolation, and also students have been working in isolation for the last 12 months. We also know remote instruction does not work for everyone. And so what are we going to do with people who have been, or students who've been working remotely and who now have to figure out a way to either close gaps or find new pathways? And we can't judge them as less than because they haven't had the opportunity or the resources to perform at the level of expectation pre-pandemic. So my invitation to us is to think about recentering what type of institutions we put in the middle and why, and then to ask ourselves, what is it going to take for us to understand the implications of that shift?
President Charlo, you've reminded us that business as usual is not working. And you've also raised the idea that we're always working in silos, how K-12 is seen as different than higher education, how we're not really viewing these transitions as thoughtfully as we should, and more importantly, how these two-year institutions are working in silos from four-year institutions, and how we're centering institutions that may have already been perpetuating the inequalities that we're seeing in our higher education system today. And as we move into this next part of our conversation, I would love to introduce the question around how we can reimagine the future of higher education. Really a practical question. What are the gaps that we're seeing? How can we mend them? How can we move this idea, this vision forward? And I'm going to open it up to the panel. Whoever would like to jump in, feel free to just jump in and share with us how we can do this work. Angelou, passing it off to you first.
How can we do this work? I mean, I think Dr. Charlo touched on a piece of it, for me at least, and this is, allowing these students to find new pathways, and whether that's in a two-year program, we have to work to take away this stigma of community college, two-year programs. There's a lot of elitism that's going into four-year programs, and in, Ivy League versus, I've seen it, in my own family, so it exists, it's real. So we have to really reframe how we even refer to different types of educational programs. But I would say we have to allow young people to really lead, so for them to understand that they are empowered, they have what they need, and we need to be providing them with more, in terms of, because they are already working on solutions, they're working on these societal ills and societal challenges and environmental challenges that, we're all facing. And that, and I hate to say it, but a lot, the boomers and, like the older, and I'm included, not in boomers, but I'm up there, we have to really give them and support them and mentor them and give them what they need. And there's so many different ecosystems that could work together. And I'm a really big believer in collaboration. So, I don't believe it's just one institution, the education, higher education, that can do this alone. I believe that there's so many different facets of society that need to work together to successfully move these young people along.
Thank you for that, Angelou. Inviting President Charlo and President Washington to react to that, Angelou has brought up this idea of partnership, this idea of how we can center young people, how we can center student voice in the work of an institution. How have you folks seen this done? How would you encourage other leaders to push this forward?
We have to change the way in which we are incentivizing and rating our institutions, and such that they actually have this focus. Look, we're going to have to reskill and upskill and retrain millions of people in this country to deal with the post-pandemic realities. We haven't really dealt with them yet, but we're seeing it happen. Automation is real. We're gonna have to retrain people to really fit into that new society that we know is coming. That means that we need clear pathways that allow people to start where they are and end up with advanced degrees or training or certificates or their own business. Have these outcomes, have them focus on success of the individuals. And we need to have combinations of institutions working together that focus on the grand challenges affecting our communities. The reason we were hit so hard by a pandemic, even after knowing that, we escaped SARS, we escaped MERS, we escaped Ebola, those all came previously. We knew we were going to get hit at some point, but we didn't come together to put the proper structures in place to deal with it. And so the reality is that the next one is coming. And so we have to rethink how we incentivize and position our institutions. Maybe the funding pathways should flow towards those institutions who have, partnerships at every level that provide these pathways. Maybe the rankings should be focused in the same vein. Those institutions that are most impactful, that reach the largest number of people. Right now, institutions are currently ranked by the amount of people they exclude, right? The more exclusive you are, the higher you're ranked. Well, that should be flipped on its head. The more inclusive you are, the higher you're ranked. The more people you're helping impact the country and the world and the globe, the higher you're ranked, right? And the more partnerships you have across institutions, right? So four-year institutions have to have partnerships with community colleges. You have to have strong ones. Four-year institutions have to have partnerships with non-governmental organizations, not just the government. And when you start incentivizing and ranking institutions along those lines, you'll get better outcomes because we manage what we measure. And as you start to measure it, we as on the academic front will start to manage towards those frameworks.
I wholeheartedly agree with you, President Washington. And I think the notion of partnerships that Angelou described within the context you're talking about in terms of what we're measuring inside of those partnerships will serve as an incentive for institutions to move. But I would also, and I was also invite us to think about how are we entering the reimagining of these conversations and these relationships? Because again, if we at a personal level don't educate ourselves about the different sectors we're talking about, we're going to replicate the system that we're trying to evolve from. And knowing this community is very committed to human-centered design, I would invite us to have a human-centered design with your local community college, have a human-centered design exercise with your K through 12 system, and really begin to understand how to value these institutions on their own terms. You know, very often the case system that's been talked about is so embedded in our systems, we don't even recognize how we replicate, and we come to the table with institutions like the one I'm in, and there's an inherent assumption that we are less than. And if we're not careful about the subtleties, and they're not all always intentional, they're just subtleties around what those partnerships might look like, we will end up excluding people within the context of a vision that appears to be inclusive, but when you look more deeply, it isn't necessarily doing things any differently. And so this notion of reimagining the system cannot happen without having a deep understanding and an appreciation. And I'm focusing on 2 years because that's my sweet spot. But Angelou mentioned HBCUs and a range of other institutions that operate very differently than the dominant model has designed workforce readiness to expect. And another component of this, when you start to look more closely at the 2-year institution and valuing it on its own terms, what you'll find out is what our sweet spot is really is exactly what is needed in this moment. We can give you a rapid credential in a short period of time. The programs are designed with industry in mind because we know the return on investment for people who are working 2 or 3 jobs is they need to be able to find a job that's going to elevate their family and provide for social mobility. We are working with companies like Google and Amazon and many of the top industry partners who recognize the pathways are essential. So we don't necessarily think in terms of having an education for the sake of it, but it's very clearly designed to move people in a particular way. And so it's critical as we think about the partnerships, which are key and can also bridge some of what we are not ready to do as institutions, but a partner like Angelou could bring President Washington and myself together to make a meaningful difference. And that would level the playing field. But that can only happen if there's mutual respect in the relationship. And if you haven't spent the time to understand those partners, there's absolutely no way we're reimagining, we're just going to end up replicating.
And if I could jump in on that, I mean, I think that as we're reimagining and repositioning these institutions, it's so important to center equity, you know, and also look at who's at the table as we're actually framing all of this out, you know, because we're having these great discussions and, you know, but we really, you know, need diverse leaders, you know, because we need that diversity of thought and diversity of ideas. All of that is just so critical. And certainly in our space and working with a lot of federal land management agencies and environmental NGOs and nonprofit organizations, we're finding that, you know, first of all, the environmental sector is probably the most homogeneous field that's out there. So that's an uphill battle for us as we try to be inclusive and bring in more young people or just people of color, people that have been marginalized and left out of the conversation, often the ones that have been impacted the most. But what we're seeing is that we really have to be aware of who's sitting at these tables, because there's so many examples that I can point to, and we're saying, well, what happened here? And then when you look at who the decision makers are, and at this moment in time, I mean, I'm really thankful that we have leadership right now that seems to be centering racial equity, economics, you know, climate, health, all these different things that are really critical to us. And I'm hoping and I'm really praying that it also comes down to when these funds and resources are redistributed, that, they're coming to institutions like Dr. Charlot's and, Dr. President Washington's and a lot of the HBCUs and a lot of these change making institutions that get it, quite frankly, so we need people at the table that understand the importance of equity.
We have a question here focusing on the idea of partnerships. And speaking of these gaps, we have a question from Michelle who's asking, how can institutions be proactive in partnering with communities to start closing these gaps? She imagines that the solutions live in the communities that institutions occupy already. And I'll add a second dimension to this question. We know that higher education institutions has not fostered trust with local communities traditionally. We know that there is a gap in terms of the community engagement or the mutualistic partnership that higher education institutions have with their home communities. How can we transform that relationship? What are ways in which you've seen that happen?
Well, it starts by the development of programs and partnerships that do just that. Yes, George Mason is a 4-year institution, and not everyone who applies to George Mason gets in. That being said, we can do things to provide access and open access. And so what we did is we coupled with our local community college here in Northern Virginia, and one of the largest in the state, and we developed a partnership. And so there is a pathway now for any student, regardless of where you start. If you want to get a degree, you can start at the community college. You go there for 2 years, you get your associate's degree, you move right into Mason, you get your 4-year degree, and you get it in 4 years. Oh, and by the way, you do it with 1/3 less cost, right? We now have more than 3,500 students in that program that are actually matriculated. So these aren't small numbers. The reality of the situation is that you can do these kinds of things. It's just an example of one partnership. I can give you others. There are institutions who are doing these kinds of things and making them work. And so I want to make sure that we're clear that A, this can be done, and B, there are real examples of entities that are doing it and making it happen. So we're not talking from a pie in the sky perspective here. We're really talking very, very practical and not just practical, but we're talking about things that are actually happening. So when I say we can provide a pathway such that every single student, no matter where you are in a state, can find a low-cost option towards an advanced degree or their own business, that's plausible. That is not something that we have to think is way off in the future. That is plausible. We can do it now. We can put the mechanisms in place. And we're going to provide a model in the state of Virginia that actually does that. That's our big, hairy, audacious goal. There will be no Virginian who wants an advanced degree or their own business that we won't provide a pathway in order for them to do it. We call that the New Virginia Promise. There are other things happening in other states that can do the same thing. But this is a solvable and tractable problem. It just takes, as both of our other panelists have said, it just takes a undoing of our previous norms and a rethinking of what we can do to impact our future.
And if I may jump in, I think that's absolutely right. And I can share another concrete example, being on the receiving end of the kind of calls that President Washington described. I got a phone call from a 4-year partner who said, basically, we are looking at a tech society, and what we know is, depending on who's creating the algorithms and who's designing the tech, what we're going to get out of that will, again, not advance the equity and inclusion goals that matter, and could have detrimental impact if we're not careful. So we need to diversify who is involved in creating the new tech culture that we are all stepping into. And the conversation then went something like this. We know you're really good at educating students from diverse backgrounds, and we want to learn from you. This means we want to do faculty to faculty exchange. We want to create training opportunities where both of our faculty can work together to figure out how do we grow this pipeline. But the ask in the conversation wasn't just give us your students. It was how can I respect the value added partnership you can bring to this conversation, and how do we co-create a solution for a societal issue? And I think it's key when we think about these partnerships. Often the conversation of enrollment is in the back of everyone's mind because this is a dollars and cents industry, and you do need revenue from people being enrolled in your programs. If you're looking at these partnerships from that lens, it's too short-sighted. And you're missing a tremendous opportunity to actually leverage expertise on both sides of the table. And so as you think about beginning the kinds of conversations we're talking about, having a mutually respectful relationship helps, but also honoring the spaces that we're coming in from in order to recognize the value added that can be contributed.
And I want to just add that there's also, when you were just speaking, Dr. Charlotte, I realized that empathy needs to be something that's taught. If it's not there, it needs to be taught, I believe, starting in K through, all the way up to 12, but also in higher education. Because if we're not producing young adults that care for other people, that's, you started off by talking about technology and how we need engineers that have empathy. We need every single profession to care for others and for their fellow human beings, and leaders to actually lead with empathy centered. So I think that is another role, and I know that as we embrace a lot of the social innovation and change making institutions, that is something that I believe, and I think a lot of them are doing it, but something that needs to be front and center as we move forward with this reimagined role for education.
I'd love to pull a question from the chat that I think relates to this idea of creating empathy, really centering empathy and having that opportunity for dialogue to happen on our higher education campuses. What is the role of higher education institutions in addressing the injustices committed against our Indigenous communities and creating a movement for healing, equity, understanding, respect, and inclusivity? That question is from Kendall Gray. Inviting you folks to jump in, what is the role of higher education institutions in that work?
We first and foremost must start with our primary purpose, which is to educate, which is to teach. You will be surprised at how little, not just the general public, but even individuals in our very institutions understand about the plight of all people, right? In the development and establishment of that institution, in the development and the establishment of that region, that state, wherever it is that you exist. I'm learning more and more every day about the contributions of many that affect my very campus. We have to educate, but we also have to tell the truth. We have to tell it all begins in truth. We have to tell the story of what happened to Indigenous people in this country. And we have to make it personal by focusing on what happened to Indigenous people in the very region and the very grounds in which we walk and stand every day, right? It's enough to say, it's one thing to say about what happened in another part of the country. It's a different thing to say what happened in this community, what was done to, and that's where academic institutions come in, because we actually have the resources, the wherewithal, and in many cases, the aptitude amongst our faculty, our staff, and our students to mine this information and to put it in a form in which the community can understand and consume. And that's where we start. I will contend to you that first step has not happened yet, by and large, throughout the whole country, right? You can't begin to reconcile. You cannot begin to heal if you don't start on the basis of truth. And truth starts on the basis of fact, right? Fact starts on the basis of understanding, and understanding starts on the basis of discovery. All of those things have to happen.
Yes, I totally agree with that. And I think for me, as a product of an HBCU, it was very soothing for me, in lack of a better word, to go to an institution that took this intersectional approach, you know, and incorporating the culture and, you know, the history, the systemic oppression of Black people, you know. So to go to a university, and not to mention the predominantly, you know, African-American faculty and staff that's teaching this stuff, it really makes a difference in understanding and taking on that responsibility to talk to the students there about the plight that their people, you know, have endured. And I've also, in working with tribal colleges, one in particular, Haskell Indian Nations University, have taken the same approach of incorporating a lot of the culture and rituals and history. So I completely agree with Dr. Washington and President Washington in terms of it has to begin and end with truth. You can build on it from there, but good, bad, and the ugly, you have to acknowledge what has happened in order to move forward.
I agree wholeheartedly. And this is something I struggle with very deeply, you know, because I think oftentimes we enter these conversations with a lens on the injustice, with a lens on the pain, with a lens on the challenges, which has such a heavy deficit-based framing for what we know that truth to be. And yet we also know there's an element of honoring that has to happen for those who've endured those injustices, to create a new reality, to be resilient, to have that grit, and also to be empowered to create an alternate reality. And I wonder at times, if we're using this injustice framework, which is real, what is it against what, right? Like there's some kind of comparison that injustice is against that will always make it an injustice, right? In that kind of framing. And so when we think about reimagining, is it worth looking at how can we reframe some of these injustice contexts? Because there's so many. I mean, we're opening with Indigenous peoples, but we can, once we start looking at intersectionality, there's so many ways we can engage in that exploration that isn't necessarily honoring to the individual who is living it, because there are assets developed in the kind of personal agency that comes from being in those contexts. And again, in the sake of being disruptive, you know, what might it look like if we think of a more honoring framework that still tells those truths, but has those that have been affected not starting from a place of being broken, but starting from a more powerful position based on who they've become in the face of the circumstances they've had to deal with.
President Charlotte, go ahead, President Washington.
You know, I think we're hitting the issues here, and I'm gonna tell you, President Charlo, that part is very, very difficult, right? Because sometimes telling the truth puts us at a deficit. You know, even when you hear the truth from an African American perspective, when you hear the truth from what's happened to Indigenous people, when you hear the truth, those truths, the very nature of those truths can put some at a deficit. What I have always tried to do, and one of the things that is the uplifting, the other side of that, is to talk about the advances that have been made in spite of those beginnings, right? The fact that we are here on this panel speaking, given that you know that our ancestors and that Black people in this country have endured 400 years of slavery, another 100 years of forced separation, and about 70 years of what we have today, right? The fact that we can sit here is an example of triumph. You get what I'm saying, as opposed to one of deficit. And so we have to be able to find those answers and find that narrative and give that narrative in these situations as we are espousing that truth.
And
Yeah,
I'm sorry, I appreciate that, because that is the step that's often missing in the conversation, is the closing of the loop. And often it stays stuck in the injustice piece. So thank you for clarifying and helping me reconcile that for myself. Appreciate you.
Oh,
and then
Sorry.
I was gonna add, it's also critical of where you start, because if you start with slavery, for Black people and like what Trail of Tears for Native Americans, as opposed to going beyond that, then if you go beyond that, then it definitely isn't a perspective of deficit. It's so much more. So if you go beyond it and then you end with where we are and how we have triumph, then I think that is the total story. But I do think it is a balancing. So I understand your point.
I'm resonating with this idea that healing is not a statement. Healing is not a moment. Healing is continuous. Healing is reconciliation. Healing is learning. Healing is growth. And I want to bring in a question from Marina Kim, who's asking this idea of fear. Fear is often one of the deep human instincts that makes leaders hang on tight to the status quo and dig in further to old thinking. On this conversation of equity, fear is also an impetus for large-scale change. How can we get around fears to do bold change in uncertain economic times like now to recenter equity in higher ed?
I think I can start off by just saying, I understand fear. When you have been at the center and, things have just been kind of going your way, for centuries. And then all of a sudden there's a upheaval and, a repositioning and a shifting of power. Yes, there's a lot of fear that's going to go with that, but and then if I even look at it from the perspective of older people and young people kind of coming into power, and I have a lot of people, especially in the environmental movement, saying, well, where does that leave me? If I allow these young people to come in and to kind of be these new guiders or leading us, then what's my role in that? So the way that I've kind of dealt with that is to show how everybody kind of has a pivotal role that they could play, that these older people have institutional knowledge that these younger people need, so, and I also often say that these young people, they have, whether it's dealing with technology or social media, there's so much that they can do that the older generations aren't doing. So there needs to be a coming together of these two demographics, so we have to remove this, the stigma that kind of goes with, not collaborating on, that everybody's going to be staying in their silos. So I would say that, when approaching, people who are afraid of change, and that we're seeing that a lot really across many industries and platforms, we have to really understand that people are always coming from a personal, individualized perspective of like, what does this new arena or agenda mean for me? Like, how am I going to fit into this? What will my role be? Will I be obsolete? What will I do? So I think as people who are framing and reimagining, we have to make sure that there are roles for everyone in this new future that we are putting together. And that's centering equity.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. And I think one way to do that and to move away from this notion of scarcity is to lead with love. I've been talking about love for a long time. And, for some reason, higher education has centered us in our head and not our hearts. And this is a time when we're thinking about reimagining. If we really want to be radical, what if we shifted to our actual center to reimagine what exactly we're doing in these spaces? You know, one of the things that happened, just to be personal for a moment, when the pandemic first hit, I got on my knees. I felt completely overwhelmed when I thought about the communities being impacted. And at that point, it was deaths, like people were dying. And being in this kind of institution where we are at a nexus of possibility for people, recognizing the potential impact and feeling that it was too big a problem for us to solve. But it was a critical problem that we had to solve. And recognizing the training I had was inadequate, the systems in place weren't going to work, and there were no easy solutions. And feeling like in my life, whenever that has happened, what I do is I get on my knees and I humble myself. And there's a degree of self-acceptance that has to happen in that moment. I had to realize how small I was in the grand scheme of things, and I couldn't fix it all. But also, you know, entering a space of forgiveness in any shape, way, or form, because what's coming is so much bigger than what has happened in the past. And I think what you're talking about, Angelou, is when that fear is even in us as leaders, people feel it. If we have that scarcity in our framing and in our thinking, it's going to be embedded in what we do moving forward. And so I always think, when in doubt, go back to love. And we all know what that means in different contexts. But one more thing I want to say, in the community college world, we touch each other. You know, we here, and I don't know if it's a Miami thing or not, so I don't want to suggest everybody's hugging people everywhere. However, you know, where we are in Miami, how we roll is, if you see someone who isn't looking well, right? When we were in person, you might get an arm around somebody's shoulder if that seemed appropriate, or at least eye contact in a way that let people know that you see them. And so there's something about the interpersonal connection that is a new way of doing business that we can introduce in this space that could appease some of those fears.
And I guess that COVID compliant touching, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. But you know, there is a part of this that I'm just going to throw it out there. I'm going to be the
Uh-oh, what's coming?
Oh, it's coming. So look, the reality is this. Some things got to go. There are things that we are doing in this country that have got to cease and stop. And there are people who are benefiting from them who cannot continue to benefit. How do I say this in as politically correct way as I possibly can?
Just say it.
Those people are going to be afraid. They know that that time is limited. They know that these things are going away. They know that it is that a new reality is coming, and they're going to fight like hell to hold on to whatever vestiges of the past that benefited them that they could. That's what the whole voting assault and the assault on basic voting rights is happening in the country right now is all about.
Absolutely.
That's
and
what's happening.
Insurrection.
We have to recognize that it's okay for some people to be scared. They should be scared. We coming for that. We're coming to remove that. I know this sounds hard, but it's true. We have to deal with the reality of the situation, that there are some things that we are doing. We can get on our knees. We can talk about it all. We can love, but some things got to go. It has to stop. And
I want to raise Raphael.
And it is our reality. You're getting scared now, Dustin, but I gotta go there.
No, go there. Go there. I'm happy for you to go there.
But let me finish this one last slide. Those things have to stop, and we have to figure out the way to do that from the perspective of love. And I think that's where you're getting to, Charlo. but it has to go nonetheless. And there will be fearful folks because of that.
Listen, you get no objection from me. I'm right behind you, General.
I'm behind him too.
I want to pull Raphael's question into this space because I think it ties directly to what you were sharing, President Washington. You know, in this age of fake news, mass diffusion through social media and hate, how can we really teach empathy and start with truth in this context? What can higher ed do about all of the things that you're describing? How can higher ed really support this movement towards a new reality? How can higher ed help surface truth?
Well, the reality of the situation is there's a lot of falsehood and misunderstanding being propagated throughout the country. And look, this is not just our, this is not just something that we should take on. It's actually our responsibility. This is not a choice. We have been granted the ability in our society as those individuals who are put in the position to think. That is what we are ultimately paid to do, think and teach, okay? We have the responsibility of helping society understand what is true, what is happening, and what isn't. Academic institutions, that's our, regardless of where you sit in the spectrum, from community college all the way up, it's all of our responsibilities to actually help society beyond this. And to the extent that we are not out front promoting understanding around what the truth actually is, we are not meeting a core component of our mission.
But I would say, based on that, and I read one of the questions in the chat, I can't stress it enough how important it is that we take care of ourselves as leaders of institutions, of these change-making organizations. Taking that time for our well-being is so critical, even for our minds and our bodies. I know for me personally, if I don't start off my day with meditation and chanting and yoga, my whole day is kind of, not balanced. So we have to find, and Dr. Charlo said, praying and getting on our knees, like we have to tap into a spiritual, I think, energy that can kind of really help us through this time of reckoning. So it's really, really important that all of us that are a part of these discussions, and as you said, President Washington, folks are not going to be happy, because there is a reckoning that needs to happen. There's a changing of the guard, power is going to be shifted, and people are not going to go away, when things have just been so comfortable. So, in an age where, fake news and lying and, reinventing history, all of that kind of stuff has been the norm. We are the ones that have to be the truth tellers and, guarding the truth, and that way allowing us to move this forward. But it can take a toll on our bodies, so I just really want to stress, as somebody, that has experienced health issues because of, what stress can do to you. It's a killer. So we need to be around. I need to see all of us around, months to come, still talking about these issues and moving it forward. But we can't do that unless we have some sort of regime that is taking care of our bodies, our minds, and our spirits.
I agree wholeheartedly. And I'd like to enter the conversation from another point in terms of the people that we serve. I mean, we now have a generation that lives and dies by how many likes they get on different social media platforms. And so as we talk about this information literacy piece, we also have to recognize we're operating inside of a culture that supports people's identity being linked to information, whether it's true or not. People at a personal level are creating realities in order to project a certain brand and a certain image. So that information literacy is not only about the facts and the news, et cetera, but it's also how do we help people, our students in particular, start to understand their value is not tied to that type of misinformation that they themselves are putting out into the world. Because if they have some attachment to it in a way where their self-worth is associated with it, the probability of them being able to recognize it out in the world gets a bit confusing and collapsed because there's an inherent value connecting the two. And we know when that sense of self-worth is jeopardized, the kind of self-care you're describing, Angelou, it doesn't happen. And we also know that what we've seen in terms of wellness in the communities most affected by this pandemic is that those of us who are the most vulnerable are those who are not well, not just physically, but also psychologically and emotionally.
You know, this hour has really flown by. And as we close our time together, I'd love to leave our conversation with a note of hope. So as a closing question, you know, what's giving you hope? What's giving you energy? What is working right now in the field of higher ed? We'll start the same way that we started the panel. We'll start with Angelou, move to President Washington, and close out with President Charlot. What's giving you hope?
This panel, this panel, gives me hope because I just see what's possible, like from, Dr. Charlot and President Washington leading two very powerful institutions, and, me coming from an HBCU world and connecting with tribal colleges, as well as Hispanic serving institutions. I just know and feel deep down that we can do this. We can do this. We can make the choice to lead with empathy and to center equity and to lead with love. So I just believe in us. And I think that, based on this conversation that we've had today, it's a lot of work ahead of us. So I do not doubt that. It's going to be challenging. It's going to be hard work. And it's going to take courage, but I do believe that we can do it.
Thank you, Angela. President Washington, what's giving you hope?
Well, first of all, let me echo Angelou's sentiment. What's giving me hope is Pascal and Angelou. They're on this call, and you too, Dustin. The way you've managed this, I want to tell you, is phenomenal. You've done a masterful job. Look, what else gives me hope is I've been fortunate through this crisis to be on panels and to look around the country and to talk to people. There are a significant number of people who are getting the message. They're understanding that what happened to us is different. Not just the pandemic, but also the racial inequity issues that we had to deal with in the country. There is a spirit and an air of differentness that is real. And there is a cadre of leaders who are embracing that. And I'm not just talking higher ed, I'm talking folk in industry, I'm talking people in government. I am talking, it is running the gamut. It is real, it is genuine. And that gives me a spirit of hope and a spirit of anticipation of what the future may indeed hold. And I am incredibly excited about it.
Thank you for your leadership, President Washington. President Charlot, last words from you. What's giving you hope?
I almost don't want this conversation to end, frankly. I didn't realize how much I needed to be reinvigorated by this network, and that's just what it's always done for all of us. And so I am reinvigorated by everyone on this panel and our interaction on the chat. But really what lights me up is the 1 million strong that Erin talked about. We have an army we've been building for over 13 years. That is deployed, that's all over the world. We share the same values, and we really have everything we need to face this moment. If we hadn't been doing this work for 13 years, I would be a little more anxious. But what you heard in this conversation today is a seasoned and a mature network that's been cultivating the mindset and the skill set to get us to this point. So I'm optimistic, given who we are, what we believe, our understanding of people's worth, that we have what it takes to meet this moment. And I have no doubt that we will. I invite all of us to know you are not alone in your respective institutions. You can always find any one of us at any point in time. We are here for you for partnerships. And I'm reaching out to Professor Washington and Angelou. We're doing something. We're taking this on the road. But more importantly, you know, this is not happening to us. We are not victims in this moment. We've been preparing, and dare I say, we're in the middle of a movement that we can generate, because we're all in action and we're doing our own thing, but it's all going to take us in the same direction. I'm so grateful for each and every one of you. I'm sorry we couldn't see you, but we feel you. And I pray that we will stay strong and be guided by the bigger part of us as we design this new future moving forward.
I just want to end to borrow some wisdom from President Charlot. What is coming is bigger than what happened in the past. Thank you so much for this powerful conversation. I'm leaving nourished, inspired, and a little bit teary-eyed to think that this is the end of this version of Ashoka U. This conversation has reminded me of the magic that is possible in the relationships that we have cultivated in this network. Thank you all for participating in this panel. It has really been such an honor, and I'll pass it back to Erin to close us out from this session.
Wow, I'm also sitting here a little teary-eyed and but extremely hopeful. Just thank you so much, Angelou, President Charlot in Washington, and Dustin, echoing President Washington. Really, truly huge round of applause for Dustin. You just inspired me with your moderation skills, truly. But you know, this conversation, lead with empathy, reimagine success, be reinvigorated, and meet this moment. And just to echo President Charlot, what I'm walking away with is we are not alone. You know, we have been preparing, and let's take this show on the road. Count me in. Dr. Charlot knows I'm always in, but yeah, count me in. Let's take this show on the road. But as we go on to the rest of the day and then figure out, you know, how we come together next, just want to thank again our co-host, George Mason University, and also our sponsors this year, the Fetzer Institute and the J.M. Kaplan Fund. So thank you also to the Exchange Agenda Council, the Student Council, and the Advisory Council, who helped to make sure that we have these voices at this final panel today, and have curated the structure of this event. And thanks to each and every one of you who have made this final exchange really, truly so special. I can speak also from my heart. I tend to lead with love as a way of being. And, you know, Ashoka U, as one of the co-founders of this network, I never would have dreamed that we would be here today. And when I think about what Ashoka U could become, this has set the stage for the future. And just truly, from the bottom of my heart, just really thank you so much, and invite everyone to step into this final day of the content of the exchange. And don't forget that we'll be sharing out the videos of this session in the next 2 weeks. So if you need a little dose of inspiration, you can sign back in and watch this video in the future. So thank you, everyone, and we'll be in touch. See you all soon.
Thank you all.